I want you to calm down and take a deep breath, because today's story is really special. Relax, inhale deeply, and get ready to dive into an amazing tale. We're going back 700 years to a time when the sky itself seemed to turn against humanity. A time when the rain fell so relentlessly that it drowned the crops in the fields, when bread became more precious than silver, and when entire villages simply vanished. This is the story of the Great Famine of 1315, and more importantly, the silent years that followed. Years that changed Europe forever. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing in a medieval village. The year is 1316. Around you the world is unnaturally quiet. No children's laughter echoes through the narrow lanes. No blacksmith's hammer rings against anvil. Even the church bells seem muted, as if the very air has grown too heavy to carry sound. This is where our journey begins. Quick thing before we dive in. If you enjoy these stories, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps this new channel reach 10K subscribers. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now let's step into the past together. The spring of 1315 began like any other spring in medieval Europe. Peasants prepared their fields, lords collected their dues, and merchants planned their trading routes. Nobody could have imagined that they were standing on the edge of the greatest catastrophe Europe had seen in generations. Picture a farmer named Willem, living in Flanders, what we now call Belgium. Willem was 32 years old, which made him practically elderly by medieval standards. He had survived childhood diseases, a bout of fever at 20, and even a minor injury from a plough that could easily have killed him through infection. He considered himself lucky, blessed even. He had a wife, Marguerite, and 3 children who had all survived past their 5th birthdays, a miracle in itself. On a cool April morning, Willem stood at the edge of his small plot of land, barely 3 acres that he worked for his lord. The soil was rich here in Flanders, some of the best in all of Europe. The region had prospered greatly over the past century. Towns were growing, trade was flourishing, and the population had swelled to numbers not seen since Roman times. But that morning, as Willem pressed his boot into the earth, something felt different. The ground was sodden, waterlogged in a way he'd never experienced so early in the season. He looked up at the sky. Heavy grey clouds hung low, pregnant with rain. Not the light spring showers that nourished the seeds, but something darker, more ominous. "It will pass," he told Marguerite that evening, as they ate their simple meal of bread and pottage, a thick soup of oats, beans, and whatever vegetables they had stored from the previous autumn. God willing, the sun will break through tomorrow. But God, it seemed, had other plans. The rain began that night. Not a gentle patter, but a steady, relentless drumming on their thatched roof. Willem lay awake, listening. In the medieval world, people lived by the rhythms of nature. They could read the sky like we read books. They knew which clouds brought which weather, when to expect frost, when to plant, when to harvest. This knowledge had been passed down through countless generations. It was survival itself, and Willem knew deep in his bones that this rain was wrong. By morning, the rain hadn't stopped. By the second day, it had intensified. By the end of the first week, the fields were flooded. The carefully planted seeds, which should have been sprouting in neat rows, were drowning in muddy pools. Willem and his neighbors waded through ankle-deep water, trying desperately to dig drainage channels, but the rain kept coming. "In all my years," said old Jan, a man of perhaps 50 who remembered stories from his grandfather's time, "I have never seen such rain, not in spring, not like this. Across Flanders, across France, across England and the Holy Roman Empire, the same scene was playing out. The rain fell and fell and fell. April became May, and still the sky wept. The temperature dropped. Frost touched the ground in the middle of spring, killing what few seedlings had managed to push through the waterlogged soil. In the great cathedral cities, priests held special masses, praying for the rain to stop. In small village churches, peasants brought what little they had to offer, a precious egg, a handful of grain, and begged God for mercy. Processions wound through muddy streets, barefoot pilgrims carrying holy relics, certain that this was a punishment for sin, that only repentance could save them. But the rain continued. By June, When the sun should have been warming the growing crops, when farmers should have been weeding between tall green stalks of wheat and rye, the fields lay ruined. In some places, nothing had grown at all. In others, the plants that had managed to sprout were stunted, yellow, rotting from the roots up. The hay that should have been cut and dried to feed animals through the winter lay mouldering in the fields, too wet to harvest, turning to black slime. Willem stood in what remained of his field and wept, not quietly, but with great heaving sobs that shook his thin frame. Margaret found him there and held him without speaking. What was there to say? They both understood what this meant. No harvest meant no food. No food for themselves, no food to pay their lord, no food to sell at market. They had some stores from the previous year, like most families, but those were already running low after the winter. They had planned for those stores to last until the autumn harvest. But now there would be no autumn harvest. Across Europe, millions of people were coming to the same terrible realization. The medieval economy was not like ours. There were no supermarkets, no international food shipments that could arrive in days. Most people ate what they grew themselves, or what they could trade for in their local market. Towns depended on the countryside around them. Cities were fed by their surrounding regions. Everything was local. Everything was connected to the soil, to the seasons, to the success or failure of each year's crops. The population of Europe in 1315 had reached a peak. Historians estimate perhaps 75 million people lived from Ireland to Poland, from Scandinavia to Italy. This was an enormous population for a medieval economy to support. It had taken 3 centuries of good weather, expanding farmland, and relative peace to reach these numbers. But the system was fragile. There was no surplus, no safety net. Most people lived right on the edge of subsistence, eating just enough to survive, with little stored away. The rich and powerful had reserves, of course. Noble families had granaries. Monasteries had full storerooms. But for the common people, the vast majority, one bad harvest meant hunger, 2 bad harvests meant famine, and what Europe was about to experience was not one bad harvest, or even 2. It was 3 years of catastrophic crop failures, followed by years of poor yields. It would become known as the Great Famine, and it would kill millions. But in June of 1315, people didn't know this yet. They still hoped. They still believed that perhaps next year would be better. They still trusted that God would not abandon them completely. In England, King Edward II was dealing with problems of his own. His barons were rebellious. His wife Isabella was unhappy. And his favourite Piers Gaveston had been murdered by nobles just 3 years earlier. Edward was not a popular king, and the failure of the harvest only added to the mounting pressures on his reign. In France, Louis VI had recently become king after the death of his father, Philip IV. Louis was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself, but even a king could not command the rain to stop or the sun to shine. In the Holy Roman Empire, a complicated patchwork of territories ruled by princes, bishops, and free cities, the situation was equally dire. The empire had no strong central authority. Each region would face the coming famine largely on its own. By late summer, prices were rising. A bushel of wheat that had cost a few pennies the year before now cost shillings. Those who had grain to sell could demand whatever price they wanted, and desperate people paid. Families sold their tools, their animals, even their clothes to buy food. Thieves became more bold, stealing from granaries and storehouses. In some places, armed guards were posted to protect food supplies. Willem and Margaret made their stores last as long as they could. They watered down the pottage until it was little more than flavored water. They mixed sawdust with their flour to make the bread stretch further. They sent their 2 oldest children to live with Margaret's sister in a nearby town, hoping the children would have a better chance there. Their youngest, little Catrian, only 3 years old, stayed with them. She was too young to be separated from her mother. By September, when the harvest should have been in full swing, there was almost nothing to harvest. Some desperate farmers tried to collect what they could: green, unripe grain, rotted vegetables, anything that might provide some nutrition. They tried to dry the damp grain, but much of it was already infected with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The first deaths began in October. Old Jan was among the first in Willem's village. He simply didn't wake up one morning. His body, already weakened by age, couldn't survive on the meager rations. His daughter found him cold in his bed, his face peaceful. He had died in his sleep, which was a mercy. Others were not so fortunate. A family of 5 in the next village, a mother, father, and 3 children, were found dead in their cottage. They had starved slowly over weeks. Neighbors had heard the children crying, but there was nothing anyone could do. Everyone was hungry. No one had food to share. In the towns and cities, the situation was even worse. Urban populations depended entirely on food being brought in from the countryside, but the countryside had nothing to send. Markets stood empty. Bakers had no flour. Butchers had no meat. The animals were dying too, without hay to eat through the winter that was now approaching. People began to eat things they never would have considered before. Tree bark, boiled and chewed until their mouths bled. Grass, which human stomachs cannot digest. Leather belts and shoes softened in water. There are records from this time of people catching rats, cats, and dogs to eat, of people digging up roots in the forest, many of which were poisonous, of people eating clay and dirt in a desperate attempt to fill their bellies. And there are darker records too, records that speak of things almost too horrible to mention. But we must speak of them, because they are part of this history. In the winter of 1315-1316, there are documented cases of cannibalism. Starving people, driven mad by hunger, turned on the dead, and in some cases, on the living. In one recorded incident in Ireland, people were executed for murdering and eating travelers. In Poland, there are accounts of parents eating their own children who had died of starvation. We must understand, these were not evil people. These were ordinary men and women, mothers and fathers, who had been pushed past the breaking point of human endurance. The Great Famine stripped away the thin veneer of civilization and revealed what happens when humans are reduced to their most basic instinct, survival at any cost. Willem and Margriet heard the rumors. They heard the whispered stories in the village, the things people had done in other places. They looked at each other in their cold, dark cottage, with little Catriona sleeping fitfully between them. Her belly distended from malnutrition, and they understood how close they were to that edge themselves. "We must not," Margriet whispered one night. "Whatever happens, we must not lose our souls." Willem nodded in the darkness, but he wondered how long their souls would last if the hunger grew much worse. Winter came early that year and was brutally cold. Snow fell on fields that had produced almost nothing. In normal times, people would have retreated indoors, living off their autumn harvest and the preserved food they had prepared. But there was no harvest to live off. The stores were empty or nearly so. People began to freeze as well as starve. Fuel was scarce. Firewood had to be gathered from forests that were now picked clean. The weak and the elderly simply couldn't survive without adequate food and warmth. Death rates soared. In cities like Paris, London, and Bruges, corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. The frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible anyway. Bodies were sometimes left in the streets, covered with snow, waiting for spring when the earth would soften enough to dig. The church tried to maintain order, to provide spiritual comfort even when material comfort was impossible. Priests shared what food the monasteries had with their parishes, but even these stores were limited. Some monasteries actually went hungry themselves, having given away everything they had. But there were also those who hoarded. Wealthy merchants who saw an opportunity for profit and locked away grain to sell later at even higher prices. Nobles who ate well while their peasants starved, claiming it was their right as lords to be fed first. These actions bred resentment that would simmer for generations. In some places, the social order began to break down entirely. Hungry mobs attacked granaries and storehouses. In Saint-Denis near Paris, starving people rioted in the streets. In Flanders, textile workers who couldn't afford bread rose up against their masters. These revolts were brutally suppressed, but they were signs of the deep instability the famine was causing. Crime rates exploded. Theft, robbery, murder, all increased dramatically. People who had been law-abiding their entire lives turned to crime out of sheer desperation. Roads became dangerous. Bandits attacked travelers, not for their money, but for any food they might be carrying. Even armed merchants were not safe. Willem tried to keep his family safe, but it became harder every day. Their food ran out completely in January 1316. For 3 days, They ate nothing. Little Catrian had stopped crying. She didn't even have the energy for that. She just lay listlessly, her eyes too large in her thin face. On the fourth day, Willem made a decision. He told Margriet he was going to the forest to look for anything edible. Roots, bark, anything. But really he was going to the Lord's manor. He was going to steal. He knew the punishment for theft from a noble's stores. He could be hanged, or have his hand cut off, or be branded as a thief. But what did it matter? If he didn't get food, his family would die anyway. At least this way there was a chance. He waited until after dark, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The manor was only a mile away, but it felt like 10 miles as he stumbled through the snow. His body was weak from hunger, and several times he had to stop and rest. The manor had guards, but they were cold and miserable, and not particularly alert. Willem managed to slip past them and into the storehouse. Inside, he nearly wept at what he saw. Sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, wheels of cheese, more food than his family would eat in a year, just sitting here while people starved. He filled a sack with as much as he could carry, grain mostly, and a small piece of salt pork. His hands shook as he worked. At any moment he expected to hear a shout, to feel a hand on his shoulder, to be dragged before the Lord for judgment. But God or luck or fate was with him that night. He made it out unseen and stumbled home through the snow, the sack heavy on his back, but his heart lighter than it had been in months. Margriet gasped when she saw what he had brought. They both knew what this meant, that Willem had committed a crime that could cost him his life. But they were past caring about such things. They had grain. They would live, at least for a little while longer. That night they ate. Not much. They had to make it last. But it was real food, and it was enough. Little Catrian smiled for the first time in weeks, and the sound of her weak laughter was the most beautiful thing Willem had ever heard. They were lucky. Hundreds of people who tried what Willem did were caught. They were punished harshly, not just as a penalty for their crime, but as a warning to others. The nobles were terrified that if they didn't maintain order, if they showed any weakness, the entire social structure would collapse into chaos. In some places, it already had. In the Scottish Highlands, clan warfare intensified as different groups fought over dwindling resources. In Ireland, violence between English settlers and native Irish escalated. The famine didn't create these conflicts, but it amplified them, made them more desperate and more brutal. In Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Hungary, whole villages were abandoned. People simply left, hoping to find food somewhere, anywhere. They became refugees in their own lands, wandering from place to place, begging, stealing, dying by the roadside. The roads of Europe in 1316 were lined with corpses. Travelers described having to step over bodies, of seeing skeletal figures huddled under trees too weak to move. It was like a vision of hell, the living and the dead mingling together in a landscape of despair. Spring came late in 1316, and when it did, people's hopes rose. Surely this year would be better. Surely God would not let this continue. Seeds were planted again, though many farmers had eaten their seed grain over the winter and had nothing to plant. Tools had been sold or stolen, draft animals had died or been slaughtered for meat. But still, people tried, and once again, the rain came. The spring of 1316 was not as wet as 1315, but it was wet enough. The crops that did manage to grow were pitiful. Another poor harvest was all but guaranteed. When people realized this, when they understood that there would be no relief, that the nightmare would continue, something inside many of them simply broke. Despair settled over Europe like a fog. Suicide rates increased. People walked into rivers and let the water take them. Others hanged themselves in their barns. Still others simply lay down and waited for death to come. The psychological toll of the famine was perhaps even worse than the physical. Humans can endure incredible hardship if they believe it will end, if they can see hope on the horizon. But when hope dies, when people believe there is no future, the spirit breaks in ways the body never could. Willem and Margriet held on, but barely. The grain Willem had stolen lasted through the late winter, and they were able to trap a few rabbits in the spring. Though game was scarce, everyone was hunting. They foraged for wild plants, taking risks with species they weren't sure about. Marguerite developed a terrible stomach illness that nearly killed her, probably from eating something toxic. Their situation was replicated millions of times across the continent. Families struggling day by day, meal by meal, watching each other slowly waste away. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that between 10 and 25% of the population of urban areas died during the famine years. In rural areas, the death rate was somewhat lower, perhaps 10 to 15%, because people in the countryside at least had some access to wild food. But that still means millions of deaths. Entire bloodlines were wiped out. Skills and knowledge that had been passed down through generations were lost as craftsmen and craftswomen died without apprentices to teach. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned and never resettled. The social fabric of medieval Europe was torn apart. The relationship between lord and peasant, which was supposed to be one of mutual obligation, the lord protected the peasant worked for the lord, was exposed as hollow. Lords had failed to protect their people from starvation. This bred a resentment that would eventually explode in peasant rebellions later in the 14th century. The church too lost some of its moral authority. People had prayed, had done penance, had given what little they had to the church, and still the rain came, still people starved. Why had God abandoned them? What had they done to deserve this? These questions would linger and contribute to a gradual erosion of the church's unquestioned power. Summer 1316 was better than the previous year, but still poor. Some regions managed to harvest enough to survive, but many did not. Prices remained catastrophically high. A measure of grain that had cost a few pennies before the famine now cost many times that, far beyond what ordinary people could afford. This created a new division in society. Those who had money, who could afford the inflated prices, survived relatively well. Those who didn't have money, the vast majority, continued to starve. The gap between rich and poor, always present in medieval society, became a chasm. In the cities, the situation was particularly acute. Urban craftsmen and laborers earned wages, but those wages couldn't keep pace with the rising food prices. Records from London show that wages increased by perhaps 50% during the famine, but food prices increased by 300% or more. The math was simple and brutal. People couldn't afford to eat. Guilds tried to help their members, providing some aid, but resources were limited. Municipal governments attempted price controls, fixing the cost of bread by law, but this often just meant there was no bread to be found at any price. Bakers couldn't afford to make bread at the controlled prices, so they stopped making it at all. The famine also had surprising effects on politics and warfare. Armies couldn't march without food, horses couldn't fight without fodder. The constant wars that had characterized medieval Europe for centuries slowed down considerably during the famine years. Not because anyone had a sudden desire for peace, but because it was physically impossible to maintain large military forces when everyone was starving. King Edward II of England had been planning a campaign in Scotland, but the famine made it impossible. His army literally couldn't find enough food to sustain itself. The Scottish Wars, which had been going on since the 1290s, essentially paused during the famine. Even hatred and ambition have to bow before hunger. In France, similar problems plagued military operations. The constant struggles between the French crown and various rebellious nobles were dampened by the simple fact that nobody could feed an army. The famine enforced a kind of peace through desperation. But when resources are scarce, when people are desperate, violence can also increase. Not organized warfare, but localized conflict, raids, attacks. This happened across Europe. Communities turned against each other, fighting over what little remained. Ancient feuds erupted into violence. The desperate attacked anyone they perceived as having food. Jews, as they often were in times of crisis, were scapegoated. In some German towns, Jewish communities were accused of hoarding grain, or of somehow causing the famine through malice or dark magic. Mobs attacked Jewish quarters, looting and killing. The authorities sometimes intervened to protect Jews, but not always. Anti-Semitism, never far from the surface in medieval Europe, intensified during the famine years. Lepers and other marginalized groups also faced increased persecution. When people are looking for someone to blame, the vulnerable become targets. It's a dark pattern that repeats throughout history. Through all of this, ordinary people like Willem and Margaret just tried to survive one more day, and then another, and then another. They had lost track of time. Days blurred together into a long agony of hunger, cold, and fear. Little Katrien survived, though she would bear the marks of malnutrition for the rest of her life. Stunted growth, weak bones, teeth that rotted early. She was one of a generation of children permanently damaged by the famine. The harvest of 1317 was marginally better. Not good, but better. But enough that people began to believe they might actually survive. The rains had eased somewhat. The summer was warmer. There was hope, fragile and tentative, but real. But the damage had been done. The population of Europe had fallen dramatically. The economy was shattered. Trust in institutions, the church, the nobility, the social order itself, had been badly damaged. The confident, expanding Europe of the 13th century had become the traumatized, uncertain Europe of the 14th. The Great Famine officially ended in 1322, after 7 years of poor harvests and hardship. But in many ways, Europe never really recovered. The psychological scars remained. An entire generation had grown up knowing hunger, watching their siblings die, learning that the world was not safe and that God did not always answer prayers. This generation would go on to face another catastrophe just a few decades later, the Black Death. Some historians argue that the famine actually made the plague worse when it arrived in 1347, because people's bodies were still weakened, their immune systems compromised by years of malnutrition. But that's getting ahead of our story. Right now, in the early 1320s, people were just beginning to rebuild. Villages slowly repopulated. Fields were planted again. Markets began to function. Life, incredibly resilient, continued. Willem and Margaret survived, though they were forever changed. Willem's hair had gone completely white, though he was only in his late 30s. Margaret developed a chronic cough that never quite went away, but they lived. They had survived what seemed unsurvivable. Their older children returned from the town where they had been staying. The family was reunited, though they were all different now, marked by what they had experienced. They didn't talk about the worst of it, the times when they had been so hungry they couldn't think straight, the neighbors who had died, the terrible choices that had been made. They just went on, because that's what humans do. We endure, we survive, we rebuild. The years immediately after the famine were strange ones. There was a sense of having survived something apocalyptic, of having looked into an abyss. The survivors were often those who had been willing to do whatever it took to live, stealing, eating things no human should eat, abandoning neighbors and sometimes even family members. This created a kind of collective guilt that hung over Europe for years. At the same time, there was relief, even joy at times. People who had survived felt grateful just to be alive, to have enough to eat, to sleep without the gnawing pain of hunger. Simple pleasures became profound. A piece of bread, a warm fire, a sunny day, these things that had once been taken for granted now seemed like miracles. In churches, priests gave sermons about Job, about suffering as a test of faith, about the need to accept God's will. Some people found comfort in these messages. Others turned away from religion entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with the horrors they had witnessed and endured. Art and literature from this period reflect the trauma. Religious paintings became darker, more focused on suffering and death. The image of the crucified Christ took on new resonance for people who had watched their own children starve. Mystery plays performed in town squares dwelt on themes of martyrdom and endurance. But there was also a new appreciation for life. Songs and poems celebrated the return of good harvests, the green of growing things, the taste of fresh bread. People held festivals with a kind of desperate gaiety, as if to prove to themselves that life could still be joyful, that the darkness had passed. The economic recovery was slow. It would take decades for production to return to pre-famine levels. With so many people dead, there was actually a labor shortage in some areas. This gave surviving peasants some leverage they hadn't had before. If your lord treated you too harshly, you could leave and find work elsewhere. This was technically illegal, Peasants were bound to the land. But enforcement was difficult when there was so much empty land and so few workers. Some historians argue that the Great Famine actually planted the seeds for the eventual end of serfdom in Western Europe. The traditional feudal system, already under strain, was badly damaged by the famine. The relationship between classes would never quite be the same. Trade began to recover as well. The great merchant cities of Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence, had suffered less than Northern Europe, being further south and having access to grain imports from the Eastern Mediterranean. They now expanded their trade networks, becoming even wealthier and more powerful. The northern cities, particularly in Flanders, took longer to recover, but eventually did. But what about the ordinary people, the Willems and Margriettes of Europe? How did they actually live in these years after the famine, in what we're calling the silent years? There's a quality to the historical record from this period that feels different from before. Chronicles and documents from the 1320s and 1330s seem subdued, quieter somehow. Fewer great events are recorded. Life seems to have contracted, become more local, more focused on simple survival and recovery than on grand ambitions. In Willem's village, life slowly returned to a kind of normalcy. The fields were replanted, animals were bred back up to sustainable numbers. Cottages that had stood empty, their former occupants dead or departed, were gradually reoccupied by younger families or by people from other villages looking for land. But the village was smaller now. Of the 40 families that had lived there in 1315, only 27 remained in 1322. The church graveyard had expanded considerably, with so many new graves that they had to start a second plot. Some graves were marked with simple wooden crosses. Many were just mounds of earth, the names of the dead remembered only in the minds of the living. The survivors formed tighter bonds in some ways. Shared trauma can create deep connections. Neighbors who had suffered together, who had seen each other at their lowest points, developed a kind of intimacy that went beyond ordinary village friendships. They didn't need to speak about what they had been through. They all understood. At the same time, there were tensions. Willem had stolen grain from the Lord's storehouse, and while he had never been caught, some people in the village knew or suspected. There were others who had done similar things, or worse. A man named Peter was rumored to have let his elderly mother starve so there would be more food for his own children. No one could prove it, but the rumor persisted, and Peter was treated with a certain coldness by his neighbors. These moral ambiguities were everywhere in the post-famine years. Who could judge what someone had done to survive when everyone had been so desperate? Yet judgment occurred anyway, subtle and corrosive. The lord of the manor, Baron Raoul, had survived the famine quite well, having maintained his stores and his lifestyle throughout. This had not gone unnoticed by his peasants. The resentment was rarely expressed openly. That would have been dangerous, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface of every interaction. When Baron Raoul rode through the village, peasants still bowed and showed the proper respect. But the respect was hollow now, performed out of necessity rather than genuine deference. The social contract had been broken, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. This pattern repeated across Europe. The nobility had failed in their fundamental obligation, and the common people remembered. It would be another 60 years before this resentment exploded in the great peasant revolts of the 1380s, but the seeds were planted in these silent years after the famine. In the towns and cities, different dynamics were at play. The merchant class had actually grown more powerful during the famine. Those with capital had been able to profit from the inflated food prices, lending money at high interest to desperate people, buying up property from families that couldn't pay their debts. This created a new wealthy class that was not based on noble birth, but on commercial success. These merchants built fine houses, wore expensive clothes, and began to rival the nobility in wealth, if not in social status. The traditional aristocracy looked down on them as vulgar nouveaux riches, but their money was real, and their power was growing. In cities like Bruges, Florence, and London, merchant guilds became increasingly political, demanding more say in how the cities were governed. They had kept the cities functioning during the famine, and they felt they deserved recognition and power, City councils that had once been dominated by nobles or appointed officials began to include more merchant representatives. This was the beginning of a long transformation that would eventually lead to the rise of the middle class and the commercial economy that would define later European history. But in the 1320s, it was still just emerging, a subtle shift in power that most people didn't fully recognize. For artisans and craftspeople, the post-famine years were a time of slow rebuilding. Workshops that had closed during the famine because the craftsmen had died or because there was no market for their goods began to reopen. Apprentices who had been released because their masters couldn't feed them were taken back on. The rhythms of skilled labor resumed. But there had been losses. A master weaver in Ghent, who had known techniques passed down through 5 generations, died during the famine without teaching anyone his methods. A particular style of glassmaking that had been unique to a workshop in Venice was lost when the entire family died. These losses were multiplied thousands of times across Europe. Knowledge, skill, and artistry that vanished and would never be recovered. On the other hand, there were innovations born from necessity. When resources are scarce, people become creative. New ways of preserving food were developed. Techniques for making bread with less grain, mixing in other ingredients, were perfected. Methods for stretching resources, for doing more with less, were shared and improved. The famine also changed people's relationship with food in fundamental ways. Before the famine, food had been abundant for most of the previous century. People had taken it for granted. After the famine, nothing was taken for granted. Every meal was precious. Wasting food became a kind of sin. This attitude would persist for generations. Marguerite, in her cottage in Flanders, would carefully sweep up every crumb after a meal, mixing the crumbs with water to make a thin gruel. Nothing was wasted. When little Catriona tried to leave food on her plate, Marguerite would scold her sharply, telling her about the time when they had had nothing, when they would have been grateful for a single crumb. Catriona didn't really remember the worst of the famine. She had been too young. But she grew up with the stories, with the constant awareness that hunger was always waiting, always possible. This made her cautious, conservative, always preparing for the worst. When she grew up and had children of her own, she would pass this attitude on to them. The famine's psychological impact lasted for generations. In the monasteries and convents, life slowly returned to normal rhythms of prayer and work. Many monasteries had depleted their stores during the famine, giving food to the poor and needy. This was seen as their Christian duty, and most monks and nuns had shared in the hunger, eating meager rations so there would be more for others. Now they worked to rebuild their stores, to return to a state of preparedness for the next crisis. Because there would be a next crisis, everyone understood that. The world was dangerous, uncertain. Security was an illusion. All you could do was prepare as best you could and trust in God. In the scriptoriums where monks copied manuscripts, there was a renewed sense of purpose. During the famine, this work had seemed almost frivolous. What good were books when people were starving? But now, with stability returning, the importance of preserving knowledge became clear again. Monks bent over their desks, carefully copying texts by candlelight, ensuring that learning would survive into the future. Some of these monks were copying chronicles of the famine itself, recording what had happened so that future generations would remember. These chronicles are our main source of information about the Great Famine today. They speak in measured, often understated language about events that must have been absolutely horrific to witness. Medieval chroniclers had a tendency toward restraint, toward recording facts rather than emotions. But even through their careful prose, the horror comes through. One monk in France wrote simply, "In this year, many died of hunger. The poor ate grass like animals. Mothers abandoned their children. May God have mercy on us all." These few sentences contain entire universes of suffering. In the villages in the years after the famine, a new rhythm established itself. It was not the confident, expanding rhythm of the 13th century, but something more cautious, more aware of limits. People worked hard, they always had. But now they worked with an awareness that everything could be taken away in an instant. The seasons passed, Spring brought planting, summer brought growth, autumn brought harvest, winter brought rest. Year by year, the memories of the famine receded slightly, not forgotten, but less immediate, less raw. Children were born who had no direct memory of the hunger years. They knew the stories, but they hadn't lived through it. Yet something had changed in the European consciousness. There was a darkness now, an awareness of human vulnerability that hadn't been there before. The confident Christianity of the 13th century, which had believed that the world was ordered and that human society was progressing toward greater godliness, had been shaken. In the art and architecture of the post-famine period, you can see this shift. Churches continued to be built, but they were often simpler, less ambitious than the soaring Gothic cathedrals of the previous century. The resources weren't there for such grand projects, but also the confidence seemed to have faded. Why build monuments to God's glory when God had allowed such suffering? Religious thought began to change as well. There was more emphasis on the mystical, on direct personal experience of the divine, and less on the institutional church. Mystics like Meister Eckhart in Germany spoke of a God that was beyond human understanding, that couldn't be reached through rituals and rules, but only through internal transformation. This mystical turn made sense in a world where the old certainties had failed. If following the rules, paying your tithes, and attending Mass hadn't prevented the famine, then perhaps a different approach to faith was needed. This would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later, but in the 1320s and 1330s, it was just a growing undercurrent of questioning and seeking. In the villages, folk religion, the mixing of Christianity with older pagan practices, became even more prevalent. People prayed to saints, but they also performed rituals their grandmothers had taught them, rituals for ensuring good harvests, for protecting against disease, for bringing good fortune. The church officially disapproved of these practices, but priests often looked the other way. Everyone was just trying to survive, to find whatever protection they could in an uncertain world. Margaret had a small shrine in her cottage, a carved wooden figure of Mary that her mother had given her. She prayed to it every morning and every night, asking for protection for her family. But she also kept a dried bundle of herbs over the door, a charm against evil that predated Christianity by centuries. To her, there was no contradiction. You used every tool available, sought help from every possible source. Willem was less religious, more practical. The famine had made him question things he had once accepted without thought. If God was good and all-powerful, why had he allowed such suffering? Why had children starved while nobles feasted? These questions troubled him, but he kept them to himself. Such doubts could be dangerous if spoken aloud. Instead, he focused on what he could control. He worked his fields carefully, trying new methods he had heard about from other farmers. He saved seed religiously, never eating it no matter how hungry he was. He made sure his tools were well maintained, his cottage secure. He couldn't prevent another famine, but he could be as prepared as possible if one came. This attitude, practical, cautious, focused on concrete preparation rather than abstract faith, was increasingly common in the post-famine years. People still believed in God, still attended church, but there was a new self-reliance, a sense that you couldn't simply trust that everything would be all right. In the towns, guilds became more important as sources of social security. A guild would take care of its members when they were sick, help their widows when they died, provide apprenticeships for their sons. This mutual aid was practical, necessary in a world without government social services, but it also reflected a shift toward relying on human institutions rather than divine providence. The merchant guilds in particular grew powerful. They controlled trade, set standards for goods, regulated who could practice which crafts. They became little governments within the larger society, with their own rules, their own courts, their own sense of identity. A merchant in Bruges might feel more loyalty to his guild than to his city or his king. This fragmentation of loyalty, this multiplication of competing allegiances, would characterize the later Middle Ages. The universal claims of church and empire, which had seemed so strong in the 13th century, weakened as people turned to more local, more practical sources of community and support. Meanwhile, at the top of society, the nobility struggled to maintain their position. The famine had revealed their failure to protect their people. The economic changes of the post-famine period threatened their wealth, as the value of land-based income declined relative to commercial wealth. Wars continued the 100 Years. War between England and France would begin in 1337, but these wars increasingly seemed pointless to the common people who had to pay for them and fight in them. The chronicles of the period record numerous small rebellions, tax revolts, and local uprisings. Most were quickly suppressed, but they happened with increasing frequency. The social order was under strain. The bonds that held medieval society together were fraying, yet life went on. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about human beings, our capacity to endure, to adapt, to find meaning and even joy in the most difficult circumstances. The people of the 1320s and 1330s had survived something terrible, but they didn't spend all their time dwelling on it. They fell in love, had children, laughed with friends, took pleasure in small things. In Willem's village, there were still festivals on holy days. People still gathered at the church on Sundays, still gossiped in the market square, still celebrated weddings and mourned at funerals. The rhythms of human life continued, woven through with both sorrow and joy. Little Catriona grew into a young woman, small and thin from her malnourished childhood, but spirited and clever. She learned to spin and weave from her mother, skills that would allow her to contribute to the family income. When she was 15, she was courted by a young man from the next village, a carpenter's son named Dirk. Dirk had also survived the famine, though he barely remembered it. He had been only 6 when it began. But he carried the scars too. His older brother had died, and his father had never fully recovered, becoming prone to illness and melancholy. Dirk had learned early to be self-reliant, to depend on his own skills and strength. When Dirk asked Willem for permission to marry Catriona, Willem looked at this serious young man and saw something of himself. He gave his blessing, and in the summer of 1328 there was a wedding in the village. It was a simple affair. The family couldn't afford anything elaborate, but there was genuine joy in it. The whole village came to the celebration. There was bread and cheese, some ale that Willem had brewed, even a bit of meat, a chicken that had been specially saved for the occasion. People danced to the music of a local man who played the pipe and drum. For a few hours the sorrows and hardships faded, and there was just the pleasure of community, of celebration, of life asserting itself. Margriet watched her daughter dance with her new husband and felt tears on her cheeks. She had thought during the darkest days of the famine that she would never see this day. She had imagined Catriona dying, imagined all of them dying. But here they were. They had survived. Life continued. These moments of grace scattered through the difficult years were what made survival worthwhile. They were what people held on to when times were hard. Memories of good days, of laughter, of love. In the wider world, things were changing in ways that the people of Willem's village could barely imagine. In Italy, the Renaissance was beginning, though it wouldn't be called that for centuries. Artists and scholars were starting to look back at classical Greek and Roman culture with new interest, finding in those ancient civilizations models that seemed more rational, more human-centered than medieval Christianity. Dante had written his Divine Comedy just before the famine, and it was beginning to circulate more widely in the post-famine years. Petrarch was a young man, beginning his career as a poet and scholar. These intellectual movements were distant from the concerns of ordinary peasants like Willem, but they were part of the same larger shift in European culture, a turning away from the medieval worldview toward something new. In England, the reign of Edward II was coming to a disastrous end. In 1327, he was deposed by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, in alliance with rebellious barons. Edward was imprisoned and almost certainly murdered, though the official story was that he died of natural causes. His son Edward III was crowned king at age 14. This dynastic drama had little direct impact on most English people. Kings came and went. What mattered to the common people was whether they could feed their families, whether the harvest was good, whether they could pay their taxes. The grand politics of the realm seemed remote and largely irrelevant. In France, the situation was more stable, though the French monarchy faced its own challenges. The succession of kings, Louis the Cautious, John I, who lived only 5 days, Philip the Faithful, and then Charles IV, created uncertainty. When Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir, there was a succession crisis that would eventually lead to the Hundred Years' War. But in 1328, this was still in the future. The post-famine period was also a time of technological and economic innovation. Though the pace was slow by modern standards, new farming techniques were slowly spreading. The use of horses instead of oxen for ploughing, more sophisticated crop rotation systems, better tools. These innovations increased productivity gradually, allowing the population to begin recovering. Water mills and windmills became more common, harnessing natural forces to grind grain and perform other tasks. This freed up human labor for other work and increased efficiency. In some regions, early forms of manufacturing began to develop, particularly in textile production. Flanders was famous for its cloth, which was exported across Europe. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northern Europe, was growing in power during this period. These German traders dominated commerce in the Baltic and North Sea regions, creating a network of trade that brought prosperity to many towns. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bergen thrived as part of this network. In the Mediterranean, Italian city-states continued to dominate trade. Venice controlled much of the commerce with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Genoa competed fiercely with Venice for trade routes and commercial dominance. Florence was becoming wealthy through banking and textile production. This commercial revolution was creating new opportunities, but also new inequalities. The gap between rich and poor was growing. In the cities, wealthy merchant families built palazzo and lived in luxury, while day laborers struggled to afford bread. In the countryside, some peasants were able to improve their situation by working harder and taking advantage of the labor shortage, while others sank deeper into poverty. The church tried to address these inequalities through teaching about charity and justice, but the institutional church itself was often part of the problem. The papacy in Avignon, the popes had moved there from Rome in 1309, was known for luxury and corruption. The cardinals lived like princes, maintaining elaborate courts and spending lavishly. Many ordinary Christians were scandalized by this. How could the church preach poverty and humility while its leaders lived in splendor? This disconnect between Christian teaching and church practice would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. But even in the 1320s and 1330s, it was causing problems. Reformers emerged, calling for the church to return to apostolic poverty, to the simple lifestyle of Jesus and his disciples. Some of these reformers stayed within the church, becoming friars, Franciscans and Dominicans who took vows of poverty and worked among the poor. Others became more radical, questioning church authority itself. These were declared heretics and persecuted, but their ideas persisted underground. In Willem's village, the local priest was a decent man who shared his parishioners' hardships. He had gone hungry during the famine along with everyone else. He performed his duties conscientiously, baptizing babies, marrying couples, burying the dead, hearing confessions, saying Mass. He didn't preach sophisticated theology, he barely understood it himself, but he provided spiritual comfort and tried to help his flock live good lives. Father Benedict, as he was called, was one of thousands of village priests across Europe, anonymous men who kept the church functioning at the grassroots level. They rarely appear in history books, but they were the face of Christianity for most medieval people. Their personal character shaped how people experienced religion far more than any papal decree or theological debate. The years passed. The 1320s gave way to the 1330s. The memories of the famine grew more distant, though they never entirely faded. A whole generation now was growing up with no personal memory of the hunger years. Though they heard the stories from their parents and grandparents, Catrion and Dirk had children. 3 survived infancy, which was considered fortunate. They were raised with all the caution and awareness that their parents and grandparents had learned from the famine. Don't waste food. Be prepared for hard times. Don't take anything for granted. Willem was now an old man by medieval standards, in his 50s. His body was worn out from decades of hard labor, and the deprivations of the famine had taken their toll. He moved more slowly, his joints aching, his back bent. But he was still alive, still working his fields, still providing for his family. He would sit sometimes in the evening after the day's work was done and watch the sun set over the fields. He thought about all he had lived through, all he had seen. So many gone, so much suffering, but also so much endurance, so much courage. People had survived things that should have killed them. They had found ways to go on. He didn't articulate these thoughts clearly, even to himself. Willem was not an introspective man, but he felt them in a deep, wordless way. Life was hard, but it was also precious. You held on to it as long as you could. You did your duty to your family, your community, your God, and maybe that was enough. Margriet, sitting beside him, reached over and took his hand. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. They had survived together. That bond, forged in the crucible of the famine years, was stronger than any words could express. In 1337, King Edward III of England would claim the French throne, beginning the 100 Years' War. In 1347, the Black Death would arrive in Europe, killing perhaps half the population. The 14th century would prove to be one of the most catastrophic periods in European history, a time of war, plague, and social upheaval. But the people who had survived the Great Famine had learned something important. Humans can endure almost anything. They had looked into the abyss and hadn't flinched. They had done what was necessary to survive, and they had rebuilt afterward. This resilience, this stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless, would carry Europe through the disasters to come. The generation that survived the famine would face the plague with the same grim determination. They would bury their dead, tend their sick, and carry on. In the villages and towns across Europe, life in the 1330s was quieter than it had been a generation earlier. The population was smaller, more scattered. There was empty land everywhere, cottages that stood vacant, fields that had returned to wilderness. Europe had contracted, pulled back from the expansion of the previous centuries, but within this quieter, smaller world, there was also a kind of stability. People knew their limits now. They understood that growth couldn't continue forever, that resources were finite, that nature could be cruel. This wisdom, bought at such a terrible price, shaped how they lived. There was less optimism than there had been in the 13th century, but also less naivety. People were more realistic about what life could offer. They expected hardship. They prepared for disaster. They treasured the good times when they came, knowing they wouldn't last. This mindset, born from the famine years, would characterize European culture for generations. Even today, if you look at traditional European attitudes toward thrift, toward preparing for hard times, toward not wasting food, you can see echoes of the Great Famine. The trauma was so profound that it shaped culture in ways that persisted for centuries. In the monasteries, monks continued their work of preserving knowledge, copying manuscripts, maintaining libraries. They didn't know it, but they were creating a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one, keeping learning alive through the dark times. When the Renaissance came, these manuscripts would be rediscovered and would help spark the revival of classical learning. The Islamic world, which had preserved so much Greek and Roman knowledge during the early Middle Ages, continued to be a source of learning. European scholars were beginning to translate Arabic texts into Latin, bringing back ideas about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that had been lost in the West. This intellectual exchange would accelerate in the coming decades. In the universities of Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and other cities, scholars debated philosophy and theology. They argued about the nature of universals, about the relationship between faith and reason, about the structure of the cosmos. These debates might seem abstract and irrelevant to the concerns of ordinary people, but they were part of the ferment of ideas that would eventually transform European thought. William of Ockham, an English Franciscan friar, was developing his famous principle of parsimony, Ockham's razor, which argued that the simplest explanation is usually the best. This principle, which seems simple, was actually quite radical. It suggested that you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity, that you should prefer naturalistic explanations to supernatural ones when possible. This way of thinking would eventually contribute to the development of modern science. But in the 1330s, these were just ideas being discussed in universities. For people like Willem and Margriet, the important questions were much more concrete. Would the harvest be good this year? Would the children stay healthy? Would they have enough firewood for winter? These practical concerns filled their days. They got up with the sun and worked until it set. They attended church on Sundays and holy days. They helped their neighbors when they could. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They lived the rhythms of agricultural life that had been essentially unchanged for thousands of years. Yet even in these conservative, traditional communities, change was slowly happening. Sons who would have traditionally taken up their father's occupation were sometimes doing something different. A farmer's son might become a carpenter. A merchant's daughter might marry a craftsman. The social mobility was limited by modern standards, but it was more than there had been before the famine. The labor shortage caused by the famine deaths had created opportunities. There was land available for those willing to work it. There was demand for skilled labor. Young people had options that their parents hadn't had. This would accelerate after the Black Death, when the labor shortage became even more severe. But it was already starting in the 1330s. Women, in particular, found slightly more opportunities. With so many men dead, women sometimes took on roles that had traditionally been male. Widows ran businesses. Women worked as brewers, bakers, craftswomen. They were still subject to numerous legal and social restrictions, but the catastrophes of the 14th century had created small openings in the rigid social structure. Catriane, for instance, was not just a wife and mother. She also had her weaving, which brought in income that gave her some independence. She sold her cloth at the market and kept the money. This was her contribution to the family economy, and it gave her a voice in family decisions that her grandmother probably wouldn't have had. These small changes, multiplied across millions of families, were slowly transforming European society. The world of 1340 was not fundamentally different from the world of 1300, but it was different in subtle ways. The cracks in the medieval system were widening, preparing the way for the greater changes to come. The climate, too, was changing. The medieval warm period, which had lasted from roughly 900 to 1300 and had helped make possible the population growth and agricultural expansion of the High Middle Ages, was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning, bringing cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more unpredictable weather. This climatic shift was gradual. People didn't recognize it as a long-term change at the time, but it made agriculture more difficult and contributed to the series of disasters that struck 14th century Europe. The Great Famine was partially caused by this cooling trend. Future famines and crop failures would also be linked to it. Nature, indifferent to human suffering, was shifting in ways that made life harder for the millions of people who depended on the land. They couldn't understand why. They didn't have the scientific knowledge to recognize climate change, but they experienced the effects. They knew that the weather seemed less predictable, that crops sometimes failed for no apparent reason, that winters seemed harsher. They prayed for better weather, for God's mercy, for protection from natural disasters. Sometimes their prayers seemed to be answered, sometimes not. They couldn't control the weather, so they did what humans always do. They adapted as best they could. They tried different crops, different planting times, different methods. Some worked, some didn't. It was trial and error, guided by accumulated wisdom and desperate necessity. In the forests of Europe, which still covered much of the continent, life went on largely unchanged. Wolves and bears still roamed. Wild boar were hunted by nobles. Deer were protected as aristocratic game, though poachers risked harsh punishment to hunt them illegally. The forest provided wood for fuel and building, mushrooms and berries for food, herbs for medicine. It was both a resource and a danger, a place of sustenance and risk. People told stories about the forest, tales of wolves that walked like men, of fairies and spirits, of ancient magic. These stories were partly entertainment, but they also expressed real fears. The forest was unknown, uncontrolled, dangerous. People who went too deep into it sometimes didn't come back. Yet the forest was also being pushed back, cleared for farmland. This process, which had accelerated during the population growth of the 12th and 13th centuries, had slowed during the famine, but hadn't stopped entirely. Slowly, year by year, the wilderness was being tamed, brought under human control. Rivers, too, were being harnessed. Watermills had existed for centuries, but they were becoming more sophisticated and more numerous. The power of flowing water was used to grind grain, to full cloth, to drive hammers in ironworking. This was the beginning of mechanization, though nobody thought of it that way at the time. It was just practical use of available resources. Technology developed slowly in the medieval world, but it did develop. Each generation inherited the accumulated knowledge of previous generations and added to it, making small improvements: a better plough design, a more efficient mill, an improved technique for smelting iron. These incremental advances, almost invisible in the moment, added up over time to significant change. The stirrup, for instance, had revolutionized warfare centuries earlier by making mounted knights more effective. The heavy plough had allowed the cultivation of the thick, rich soils of northern Europe. The three-field system of crop rotation had increased agricultural productivity. These technologies had made possible the medieval civilization of the 14th century. Now new technologies were emerging. The mechanical clock was being developed, though it wouldn't become common until later. Eyeglasses were being invented, allowing older scholars to continue reading and writing. Gunpowder, imported from China, was beginning to appear in Europe. Though its military applications were still primitive, these technologies would eventually transform European society. But in the 1330s, they were just curiosities. Interesting but not yet important. Most people lived and worked much as their ancestors had for centuries. Change was slow, incremental, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime. Willem would have recognized his grandfather's world easily. The tools were the same, the methods were the same, the rhythms of life were the same. He expected his grandchildren would live in essentially the same world he did. Change wasn't something most people anticipated or desired. Stability was valued. Tradition was respected. The old ways were best. Yet underneath this surface stability, currents were flowing that would eventually carry Europe into a very different future. The commercial revolution was creating new forms of wealth and power. The intellectual ferment in the universities was questioning old certainties. The experiences of famine and disaster were undermining faith in traditional institutions. The world was pregnant with change, even if most people couldn't see it yet. In 1340, Willem fell ill. It wasn't dramatic, just a fever that wouldn't break, a weakness that grew day by day. Margaret tended him as best she could, using all the herbal remedies she knew, praying to every saint she could think of. Katrien came to help, bringing her children to say goodbye to their grandfather. Willem knew he was dying. He had seen enough death to recognize it. He wasn't afraid, particularly. He had lived longer than most people did. He had survived the famine. He had seen his children grow and his grandchildren born. It was enough. On a quiet evening in early autumn, with Margaret holding his hand, Willem died. His last thoughts were of his fields, of the harvest that had just been brought in, of the cycle of planting and growing that would continue after he was gone. Life went on. It always did. They buried him in the churchyard in a grave next to his parents and his siblings who had died young. Father Benedict said the prayers. The village came to pay their respects. Margaret and Katrien wept. Then everyone went back to their work, because the work never stopped. There were fields to tend, animals to feed, children to raise. Margaret lived another 5 years, dying in 1345 at the age of 62, which was old by medieval standards. She had outlived most of her generation. She had survived the famine, raised her children, and seen her grandchildren grow. On her deathbed, she told Katrien to always be prepared, to never waste food, to remember the hungry years. Katrien promised, though she didn't really need to. Those lessons were carved deep into her soul. In 1347, 2 years after Margaret's death, ships arrived in Sicily carrying rats infected with fleas that carried bubonic plague. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. Within 5 years, it would kill between 30 and 50% of Europe's population, perhaps 25 million people. Katrien and her husband Dirk both died of plague in 1348. 2 of their 3 children died as well. Only their youngest son, also named Willem after his grandfather, survived. He was 12 years old when his parents died, old enough to remember them, young enough to rebuild a life afterward. This young Willem inherited his grandparents' cottage and fields. He married a girl from another village whose entire family had died of plague. Together they started over, 2 survivors clinging to life in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. The Black Death was even worse than the Great Famine had been. More deaths, more sudden, more terrifying. But the generation that had survived the famine had taught their children how to endure. They had shown that it was possible to survive the unsurvivable, to rebuild after catastrophe, to go on when everything seemed lost. Young Willem and his wife planted their fields, raised their children, and lived their lives. They remembered the stories about the famine, about the grandparents who had survived it, about the resilience of the human spirit. These stories gave them strength when they needed it most. The silent years after the famine had been a time of recovery, of rebuilding, of quiet endurance. They hadn't been dramatic or heroic. There were no great battles, no spectacular events. Just millions of ordinary people doing their best to survive and to create lives worth living. But in that ordinary endurance, there was something profound. The people of those years had faced the worst that nature and circumstance could throw at them, and they hadn't broken. They had bent, certainly. They had been changed, scarred, diminished. But they had survived. They had lost their innocence, their confidence that the world was ordered and just. But they had gained something too, a deeper understanding of human resilience, of the capacity to endure suffering and still find meaning, still find moments of joy and beauty. In the villages and towns across Europe in the 1340s, just before the plague arrived, life had achieved a kind of balance. The population had stabilized at a lower level than before the famine. Agriculture had adapted to the cooler, wetter climate. The economy had adjusted to the new realities. It wasn't the prosperous, expanding world of the 13th century, but it was stable, sustainable. If the plague hadn't come, Europe might have continued in this way for decades or even centuries, recovering slowly, gradually rebuilding. But the plague did come and everything changed again. The 14th century would go down in history as one of the most catastrophic periods of human history, a time of overlapping disasters that seemed almost designed to test humanity to its limits. Yet humanity survived, not because people were strong or heroic or special, but simply because they refused to give up. They endured because endurance was the only option. They went on because going on was what humans do. The story of the silent years after the Great Famine is not a story of triumph or victory. It's a story of survival, of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and doing what they had to do. It's a story of quiet courage, of daily acts of persistence that added up to collective resilience. These people, farmers like Willem and Margriet, craftspeople like Dirk, their children and grandchildren, didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just trying to live their lives, to protect their families, to maintain their dignity in the face of forces they couldn't control. But that's what heroism actually looks like most of the time. Not grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but the daily decision to keep going, to keep trying, to keep hoping even when hope seems foolish. The Great Famine of 1315-1322 killed millions, but it didn't destroy the human spirit. The survivors rebuilt. They adapted. They created new ways of living that acknowledged the harsh realities they had learned, but didn't surrender to despair. They taught their children to be careful, to be prepared, to take nothing for granted. But they also taught them to appreciate the good things when they came, to find joy in simple pleasures, to treasure the people they loved. These lessons, forged in the crucible of famine, shaped European culture for generations. The caution, the thriftiness, the awareness of vulnerability, these became characteristic of European peasant culture and remained so well into the modern era. But so did the resilience, the stubborn refusal to be defeated, the determination to create meaning and beauty even in difficult circumstances. European culture is often characterized as pessimistic, but it's not pessimism. It's realism born from hard experience, combined with a determination to persevere despite that experience. The silent years were silent not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening was too quiet, too ordinary to make it into the grand narratives of history. History books talk about kings and wars, about plagues and famines as events, as statistics. They rarely talk about the daily life of ordinary people, the small victories and quiet endurance that actually constitute most of human experience. But those ordinary lives matter. Those small acts of courage and kindness matter. The unnamed farmer who shared his last crust of bread with a neighbor, the mother who sang to her starving child, the craftsman who kept working even when he didn't know if there would be a future. These people created the fabric of human civilization, stitch by stitch, day by day. In villages across Europe, life went on through the 1340s. fields were ploughed and planted. Animals were tended. Children were taught their letters by village priests. Young people fell in love and got married. Babies were born. Old people died. The great cycle of human life continued, as it always had, as it always would. In the markets, goods were bought and sold. Farmers brought their produce. Craftspeople displayed their wares. Merchants from distant cities offered exotic goods. Spices from the east, fine cloth from Italy, furs from the north. Trade connected people across vast distances, creating networks of exchange and relationship. In the churches, priests continued to preach and perform their sacraments. People confessed their sins, received communion, celebrated holy days. Religion provided structure and meaning to lives that were often hard and short. It offered hope for a better life after death. A reward for suffering endured patiently. Whether that hope was justified, whether there actually was a heaven waiting for the faithful, no one could say for certain. But the hope itself had value. It made life bearable. It gave people a framework for understanding their suffering, a belief that it wasn't meaningless. In the great cities, Paris, London, Cologne, Venice, life was more varied, more complex. Scholars studied in universities. Artists created paintings and sculptures. Musicians played in courts and taverns. The richness of urban life offered opportunities and pleasures that were impossible in the countryside. But urban life also had its own hardships. The poor in cities often lived in terrible conditions, crowded into filthy alleys, vulnerable to disease, dependent on day labor for survival. The contrast between rich and poor was more visible in cities, more stark, more potentially explosive. The cities were where the future was being born, where new ideas and new ways of organizing society were emerging. But they were also where the old problems, inequality, exploitation, violence, were most concentrated. Urban life was always a mixture of possibility and danger, opportunity and risk. In the countryside, the pace was slower, the changes less dramatic. But even there, in the most remote villages, the world was connected in ways that people barely understood. A decision made by a king hundreds of miles away could affect the taxes they paid. A drought in one region could affect food prices in another. A war in one country could disrupt trade routes that connected half a continent. The medieval world was not as disconnected and local as we sometimes imagine. Trade networks, political connections, cultural influences, all these linked people across vast distances. Say, a peasant in Flanders might never travel more than 10 miles from his village, but his life was shaped by forces and decisions from all across Europe. This interconnectedness would become even more apparent when the Black Death arrived. The plague spread along trade routes carried by ships and caravans, moving from city to city, region to region, until it had infected the entire continent. No place was safe, no community isolated enough to escape. But that was still in the future. In the early 1340s, people didn't know what was coming. They lived in the present, as humans always do, dealing with today's problems, enjoying today's pleasures, not thinking too much about tomorrow. The silent years were ending. The catastrophe of the famine had receded into memory, into story, into the cautionary tales that grandparents told grandchildren. A new generation had grown up, shaped by those stories but not directly traumatized by the events. They were ready to start living their own lives, creating their own stories. And then the plague came and everything changed again. But that's another story, as dark and terrible as the famine, perhaps even darker. The 14th century would test Europe again and again, pushing human endurance to its limits. But for now, in these last quiet years before the plague, there was a moment of equilibrium. The wounds from the famine had scarred over, if not fully healed. People had learned to live with loss, with uncertainty, with the knowledge that the world was not always kind. In the evenings, when work was done, families would gather around their fires. In winter, they huddled close for warmth, telling stories to pass the long dark hours. In summer, they might sit outside their cottages, watching the sun set, listening to the sounds of the village settling down for the night. These moments, ordinary, unremarkable, barely worth recording, were what life actually consisted of for most people. Not the great events that make it into history books, but the quiet times between crises, the everyday rhythms of work and rest, the simple pleasures of food and family and community. Young Willem, grandson of the original Willem and Margriet, grew up hearing stories about the famine from his mother, Catrian. She told him about how his grandparents had survived, about the terrible hunger, about the people who had died. She told him these things not to frighten him, but to teach him, to make him understand how precious and fragile life was, how important it was to be prepared, to be grateful, to never take anything for granted. Your grandfather, she would say, was a good man. He did what he had to do to keep us alive. Sometimes that meant doing things he wasn't proud of. But he never gave up. He never stopped fighting for his family. That's what you remember. That's what you do when times are hard. Young Willem listened to these stories and absorbed the lessons. He understood, in a way that children who grow up in easier times might not, that survival required strength and flexibility, that sometimes you had to make hard choices, that the world didn't owe you anything. He also learned about community, about how people had helped each other during the famine, sharing what little they had, looking after each other's children, maintaining bonds of mutual support even when resources were desperately scarce. Humans are social animals. We survive together or not at all. This truth, always important, became starkly clear during times of crisis. The village where young Willem grew up was smaller than it had been before the famine. Empty cottages dotted the landscape, some of them falling into ruin, nature slowly reclaiming them. The fields closest to the village were cultivated, but further out, land that had once been farmland had returned to wild grass and scrub. This was the pattern across much of Europe. The population loss from the famine meant there simply weren't enough people to work all the land that had been under cultivation before 1315. Some land was abandoned, and the wilderness crept back in. Villages consolidated, with survivors moving closer together, leaving the marginal lands at the edges to revert to nature. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The pre-famine population had perhaps been too large for the agricultural technology of the time to sustain comfortably. The expansion of the 13th century had pushed into marginal lands, thin soils, hillsides, areas prone to flooding, that were difficult to farm successfully. The contraction after the famine meant people could focus on the best land, the most productive fields. But it also meant a loss of ambition, a sense that the world was shrinking rather than expanding. The optimism of the High Middle Ages, the sense that humanity was progressing and that the future would be better than the past, had given way to something more cautious and conservative. People built smaller, focused on maintaining what they had rather than reaching for more. They saved more, spent less. They made do with what they had instead of seeking new luxuries. This thriftiness, this caution, was a rational response to the trauma they had experienced, but it also constrained economic growth and social dynamism. The church, too, had changed. The easy confidence that had characterized 13th century Christianity had been shaken. How could God be both all-powerful and all-good if he had allowed such suffering? Theologians wrestled with these questions, producing sophisticated arguments about free will and divine providence. But for ordinary believers, the questions remained troubling. Some people became more devout, clinging more tightly to faith as the one certainty in an uncertain world. They prayed more, attended church more regularly, went on pilgrimages to holy sites seeking blessing and protection. Religion became more emotional, more focused on direct personal experience of the divine. Others became more skeptical, less trusting of church authority and traditional teachings. They questioned why God had allowed the famine, why prayers hadn't been answered, why the innocent had suffered alongside the guilty. These doubts were rarely voiced openly. That would have been dangerous, but they were there, quietly undermining the church's authority. The papacy, ensconced in Avignon, and increasingly focused on political power and financial administration, seemed distant from the concerns of ordinary Christians. The great vision of a united Christendom guided by the Pope in spiritual matters and the Emperor in temporal ones, this vision that had animated the High Middle Ages, was fading. In its place was a more fragmented, more diverse religious landscape. Mysticism flourished in this environment. Mystics claimed direct experience of God, unmediated by church hierarchy or sacraments. They spoke of visions of divine revelations, of a personal relationship with the divine that bypassed institutional religion. The church was suspicious of mystics. They represented a challenge to its authority. but they were also too popular to simply suppress. In the Rhineland, Meister Eckhart preached sermons that pushed the boundaries of Orthodox theology, speaking of the soul's unity with God in ways that seemed to blur the distinction between creator and creation. In England, hermits and anchorites walled themselves into cells attached to churches, living lives of extreme asceticism and prayer. In Italy, lay people formed confraternities, religious associations that allowed them to practice intense devotion without becoming monks or nuns. This diversification of religious experience was part of a broader pattern of social and cultural change. The unified world of the High Middle Ages was fragmenting into something more varied, more individualistic, more difficult to characterize simply. People were finding their own paths, creating their own meanings, not just accepting what traditional authorities told them. In literature, this shift was beginning to appear as well. The great epic poems and romances of the 13th century had celebrated knights and noble deeds, presenting an idealized vision of aristocratic culture. But newer works were more critical, more realistic, sometimes even satirical.